The moment Bernard Winslow rode into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing, because a man with a face like his did not ride slowly. He rode like he owned whatever ground his horse touched, and he was not the kind of man anyone wanted to owe anything to. The scar ran from just beneath his left eye all the way down to the corner of his jaw, a thick, pale ridge of skin that told anyone who looked too long a story about fire or blades or both. He was broad through the shoulders, dressed in a worn leather duster the color of dried tobacco, and he carried two Colt single-action Army revolvers on his hips with the practiced ease of a man who had never once in his adult life gone without them. His hat was low and dark, his boots were scarred leather, and the horse beneath him, a slate-gray gelding named Cutter, was the only creature in Caldwell that did not appear to be afraid of him. He tied Cutter at the post outside the Caldwell Herald, the town's only newspaper office, and he walked inside without knocking. The editor, a thin man named Horace Pell, looked up from his press with the expression of someone who had just swallowed something unpleasant. "You the one who placed the advertisement," Bernard said. His voice was low and unhurried, and it carried the faint roughness of a man who had spent a great deal of time outdoors in wind and dust. Horace Pell cleared his throat. "That would depend on which advertisement you mean, sir." "The one about brides," Bernard said plainly. Horace Pell's eyes moved briefly to the revolvers on Bernard's hips, then back to his face, where the scar completed its long journey from eye to jaw and seemed to declare itself without apology. Pell reached beneath his counter and produced a folded paper, which he set down without handing it across, as though he were not entirely sure the man in front of him was someone who ought to be receiving such a document. Bernard picked it up himself and read it. The Caldwell Ladies' Arrangement Society, a cooperative of sorts, organized by the wives of the town's more prosperous citizens, had placed an advertisement in response to a shortage of unmarried women in the surrounding homestead territories. Families who had daughters of marriageable age were invited to bring them forward. There would be proper introductions. There would be a modest dowry arrangement. There would be a ceremony should both parties agree. Bernard folded the paper and set it back on the counter. "I want the oldest one," he said. Horace Pell blinked. "I beg your pardon. Whichever woman is oldest, that's who I want to be introduced to." Pell opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, "Mister, I'm sorry, I don't have your name." "Bernard Winslow." The name produced a visible effect on Horace Pell, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested he had heard it before, and not in any story that ended with a church social and a potluck supper. Bernard noted the reaction and said nothing about it. "Mr. Winslow," Pell said carefully, "the arrangement is meant to be mutual. The young ladies have a say in the matter." "I know that," Bernard said. "I'm not asking you to chain anyone to me. I'm asking to be introduced to the oldest woman who came forward, that's all." Pell hesitated a moment longer, then picked up a ledger from behind him and opened it. He ran a finger down the page. "The oldest woman who submitted her name," he said slowly, "is Miss Elvira Ellsworth. She is 31 years of age." Bernard nodded. "When can I meet her?" "Mr. Winslow, I think you should know, she is the oldest by a considerable margin. Most of the other women are between 18 and 24. Miss Ellsworth has been passed over several times already because," Pell paused delicately, "because the men who come to these arrangements tend to prefer." "I know what men prefer," Bernard said. "I want to meet Miss Ellsworth." Horace Pell wrote something down in his ledger, and that was how it began. Elvira Ellsworth had lived her entire life in a 3-room house on the eastern edge of the Caldwell settlement, and for the last 4 years, since the death of her father and then, 8 months later, her mother, she had lived in it alone. She kept a small garden, she sold quilts and needlework to the dry goods store in town, and she made enough to keep herself fed and the roof from caving in, which she considered a modest success. She was a tall woman, taller than most men felt comfortable with dark brown hair that she kept pinned back during the day and loose at night, and eyes the color of creek water in the fall, not quite green, not quite gray, but some honest combination of the two. She had a mouth that people tended to describe as serious, though what they usually meant was that she did not smile reflexively the way women were expected to, only when something actually struck her as worth a smile. She had been told she was handsome. She did not particularly believe it. She had also been told, on more than one occasion and by more than one well-meaning woman in town, that she was too particular, too independent, too willing to say what she thought, and that these qualities were the reason she remained unmarried. She had never argued with this assessment. She had simply gone on being exactly as she was. When the message arrived at her door, delivered by a boy from the Herald in exchange for one of her oatmeal biscuits, she read it twice. A man named Bernard Winslow had requested an introduction. He was 36 years of age. He owned land outside of Wichita. He was asking specifically for her. She sat with the message for the better part of an evening, watching the lamp burn down while the wind talked to itself outside her window. She had put her name in the arrangement book 6 months ago, half convinced it was foolishness and half terrified of what another winter alone would feel like. She had expected nothing to come of it. She had certainly not expected this. In the morning she sent back a one-line reply. "I will meet with Mr. Winslow at 2 o'clock on Thursday at the Caldwell Hotel Parlor. Miss E. Ellsworth." The Caldwell Hotel Parlor was a small room off the lobby, furnished with 2 settees and a round table and a window that looked out onto the main street. And on Thursday afternoon, it smelled of dust and old tobacco and the faint sweetness of whatever the cook had been baking in the back kitchen. Elvira arrived at 5 minutes before 2, because she had never in her life been late for anything, and she sat down on the settee facing the door and folded her hands in her lap and waited. She heard the spurs before she saw him, not the theatrical jingle that some men put on for effect, but the quieter, functional sound of a man who wore spurs because he rode regularly and had simply never developed the habit of taking them off indoors. He filled the doorway for a moment before he came through it, and then he was standing in the parlor, and Elvira looked at him without flinching. She took in the scar first because it was the most obvious thing, and then she took in the rest of him, the breadth and solidity of him, the dark, careful eyes, the way he held himself with a stillness that was not awkwardness but something closer to patience. He was holding his hat in both hands, which she noted as a courtesy. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "Sit down." He sat across from her without ceremony, and there was a brief silence during which the clock on the mantel made itself known, and the street outside produced the ordinary sounds of horses and commerce. "I'll be straightforward with you," Elvira said. "I'm told you specifically requested me, and I find that more puzzling than flattering, so I'd like to know why." Bernard looked at her steadily. "Because every man who came before me chose someone younger, and I figured a woman who'd been passed over that many times was probably someone worth actually talking to." Elvira was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual way to pay a compliment." "I wasn't paying a compliment," he said. "I was explaining my reasoning." She studied him. "How old are you?" 36. "And you've never been married?" "No." "Why not?" The question sat in the air between them, and Bernard turned his hat brim once in his hands before answering. "For a long time the work I did wasn't compatible with keeping a family safe," he said. "And before I understood that clearly enough to stop doing it, a good number of years passed." Elvira understood without pressing him what kind of work he meant, because the revolvers and the posture and the way his eyes had moved to every corner of the room when he entered all spoke plainly enough. "And now," she said, "now I have land," he said. 160 acres outside Wichita with a house on it that I've been building for 3 years. It's not finished, but it's sound. Why do you want a wife?" She asked, which was perhaps the most direct question she could have put to him, and she watched to see if it unsettled him. It did not. He met her eyes and said, "Because I'm tired of building something that no one will ever live in but me." Elvira felt something shift inside her that she could not immediately name. It was not swooning. It was not the girlish flutter she had read about in novels and privately distrusted. It was something quieter and more structural, like a door she had kept closed for a long time swinging open an inch. "I have questions about your land," she said. "Ask them," he said. She did. She asked about the water source and the quality of the soil and the nearest town and the nearest doctor, and whether the house had a proper kitchen, and he answered every question without impatience or condescension, which she found remarkable. Most men, she had observed, resented being questioned by women about practical matters as though the question itself were an insult. Bernard Winslow answered her the way one rancher might answer another, directly with facts and with what appeared to be a genuine respect for the asking. When she had finished, he said, "Do you have questions about me that aren't about the land?" "Yes," she said, "the scar." He did not touch it, but his jaw tightened fractionally. "Fire," he said, 11 years ago. Not in battle and not from someone else's doing, just a fire that I was too slow to get out of. Does it pain you? Sometimes, when it's cold." She nodded. "I ask because I intend to be your wife if we come to an agreement, not your nursemaid and not your keeper, but I like to know the shape of things before I step into them." Something crossed his face then, something she could not fully read, but that resembled, faintly and unexpectedly, relief. "That's fair," he said. They talked for another hour, and then another after that, until the parlor was dim with late afternoon shadow, and the street outside had quieted to the sounds of evening. The hotel owner's wife came in at one point and offered coffee, and they took it without breaking the conversation, which had moved well past the practical and into the territory of preferences and opinions, and the small particular details, by which one person begins to understand the shape of another person's inner life. Elvira learned that he had grown up in Missouri, had come west at 17 with nothing but a horse and a stubbornness that he acknowledged freely, had taught himself to read at 19 from a Bible belonging to a woman in Abilene who had taken pity on him, and that he kept 2 cats on his property that he spoke of with an offhandedness she found immediately endearing, because it was clear he was fond of them, and equally clear, he was not entirely comfortable admitting this. Bernard learned that she had kept her family's house and land solvent for 4 years on needlework and sheer determination, that she had read every book she could lay hands on, including 3 volumes of natural history, and a dog-eared collection of poems that she kept under her bed and would not apologize for, that she had once fired a rifle at a coyote who had gotten into her chickens and had been a better shot than she expected, and that she had a practical, clear-eyed view of what marriage was and what she needed from it. "I don't need to be loved on sight," she said when they were into their second cups of coffee. "I'm not a girl who expects that, but I need honesty. And I need to be treated as a person capable of making decisions. That's all I'd ask of you in return," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Give me until Sunday," she said. "I'll have an answer for you by Sunday." He nodded, put his hat back on, and stood. "Thank you for meeting with me, Miss Ellsworth." "Thank you for being worth meeting," she said, and meant it, and watched him walk out of the parlor with the measured, unhurried step of a man who had learned early that there was no situation so pressing it could not be faced at a walk. She sat alone in the dim parlor for another 20 minutes before she went home. The 3 days between Thursday and Sunday were not comfortable ones for Elvira. She quilted. She weeded her garden. She walked to the ridge east of town 3 times, which she always did when she needed to think clearly, and she stood looking out at the broad, pale Kansas sky and sorted through what she felt and what she knew and what she wanted. She had lived alone for 4 years and had made a respectable life of it. She was not desperate. She was not frightened of solitude. She had put her name in the arrangement book because she had looked at the future with clear eyes and understood that what she had built by herself was, by any honest measure, very small. Not insufficient, she was not prone to self-pity, but small. A 3-room house and a garden and a pile of finished quilts and no one to sit across from at supper. Bernard Winslow was not what she had imagined when she imagined, however abstractly, a husband. He was harder than she had imagined, more weathered, more clearly marked by the kind of life that did not permit softness. But he had not been unkind. He had not been condescending. He had looked at her the way she wanted to be looked at, as though she were someone who mattered, someone whose questions were worth answering, someone who was present in the room and not merely decorative. She also felt something else that she turned over carefully in the privacy of her own mind, which was that his face, scar and all, was a face she found herself wanting to look at again. She did not understand this entirely. It was simply true. On Sunday morning she dressed in her good blue dress and walked to the hotel, where he was waiting in the parlor as agreed, sitting in the same chair with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the door. He stood when she came in. "I'll come to Wichita," she said, before she had even fully sat down. "I'll see the land and the house, and if it's as you've described it, I'll agree to the arrangement." Something happened to his face then, a softening that was subtle but unmistakable, and he said, "It will be." "Then we're agreed in principle," she said. "I'd like to travel in 1 week's time if that suits you." "It suits me." "Good." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'd also like to clarify something." "Go ahead." "When I come to Wichita, I am coming to see whether the land and the house and the arrangement are as I understand them to be. I am not coming as a woman who has already decided she has no choice. I am coming as a woman who is making a choice. If I arrive and find that what you've told me is not the truth, I will come back to Caldwell and we will not proceed." "Do you understand the distinction?" Bernard held her gaze and said, "I do, and I wouldn't want it any other way." She nodded once and then, because she was a thorough person, added, "Is there anything you haven't told me that you think I should know before we proceed?" He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated the fact that he actually considered the question before answering. "I have a reputation," he said. "Most of it is earned, some of it has grown bigger than the truth. The kind of work I did before gunslinging, some bounty work, some things that don't fit neatly into a category, those things follow a man. People in any town I live near will know my name and not be comfortable with it. I want you to know that going in." Elvira absorbed this. "Is the danger to you ongoing? There are men who would hold a grudge if they knew where I was," he said carefully. "I take precautions against that, but I won't tell you it's no concern at all, because that would be a lie." "I appreciate you not lying," she said. "I want you to know that whatever comes with you, I prefer to face it knowing about it rather than be protected from it by ignorance." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, and then he said, very quietly, "You are not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Something more frightened." "Oh, I'm frightened," Elvira said matter-of-factly. "I'm simply not going to let it do my deciding for me." They left for Wichita on the following Saturday, in Bernard's wagon with Cutter tied behind, the wagon loaded with Elvira's quilts and 2 crates of her belongings and the box of books that she had refused to leave behind even though he had not asked her to. The morning they set out was bright and cool, with a wind from the north that smelled of the winter just finishing, and Elvira sat on the wagon seat beside Bernard and watched the Kansas landscape open up around them with a feeling she could not have put into words if she had tried. Half excitement, half the vertigo of a woman who has stepped off a known edge into uncharted air. They rode for 2 days, camping one night beside a creek where Bernard built a fire with the economical competence of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and they ate beans and cornbread and drank coffee that was considerably better than Elvira had expected from a campfire, because it turned out Bernard had very particular opinions about coffee. "My one genuine luxury," he said when she commented on it. "Everything else I can do without if I have to. Good coffee I cannot." "That's a very human weakness," she said. "I respect it." He looked at her sidelong across the fire, and the light moved across the scar on his face and made it look less severe, or perhaps she was simply growing accustomed to it. "What's yours?" he asked. "My genuine luxury? Yes," she considered. "Books," she said. "I know they take up space, and there's no practical argument for carrying 3 volumes of natural history across the state of Kansas, and I've made my peace with that." The corner of his mouth lifted. It was the first time she had seen him come close to smiling, and the effect of it on his face was startling. It changed everything, opened something up behind his eyes, and she found herself looking away in order to avoid staring. "I can build a shelf," he said. "What?" "In the house, for the books. I had planned to build shelves in the main room, but I didn't have a reason to put them in any particular order. Now I'll put them where you'd want them." She was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "That's very considerate," she said, and meant it more than she showed. On the evening of the second day, they came over a long, gradual rise in the land, and Elvira saw the property for the first time. 160 acres of good Kansas grassland, with a creek cutting silver through the lower quarter, a stand of cottonwood trees near the water, and the house set on the high ground where it would catch the breeze and avoid the flooding. The house was not finished, as he had said, but the bones of it were strong and square, and the 2 completed rooms were solid, and when she walked through it, she could see clearly what it would become. 3 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft, a proper kitchen with a cast iron stove that was already in place, a porch across the front that would look out at the cottonwoods and the creek. She stood in the unfinished front room with dust on her boots and afternoon light coming through the frameless windows, and she said, "You need glass for the windows." "I know," he said. "I was waiting." "For what?" "I wasn't sure what size the woman who lived here would prefer," he said simply. And that was the moment Elvira Ellsworth understood that Bernard Winslow had been waiting for her specifically, in the way that something waits for the thing it was always meant to hold. She did not say this. She walked to the window opening and looked out at the land and the cottonwoods and the creek catching the last of the afternoon light, and she said, "I'd like them tall, so you can see the sky properly from inside." "Tall it is," he said. They were married 4 days later, on a Wednesday morning in the Wichita courthouse, with a judge named Fielding who performed the ceremony in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, and who seemed not particularly interested in the scar on the groom's face, or the fact that the bride was holding a small bunch of creek wildflowers she had picked herself that morning, because she had wanted something living in her hands for the occasion. The 2 witnesses were a clerk from the courthouse and an elderly man named Thomas Reeves, who happened to be sitting in the corridor waiting for something else entirely, and who agreed to witness when Bernard asked him plainly, and who afterward shook both their hands with a warmth that felt genuine and unexpected. "Happy life to you both," Thomas Reeves said, and shuffled off down the corridor. "Thank you," Elvira called after him, and then turned to find Bernard looking at her with the expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one that meant he was thinking something he was not sure he had the right to say. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're good with people." "You say that like it surprises you." "It does," he admitted. "The ease of it, you just make them feel seen." She looked up at him. "So do you just don't realize it because you're not looking." He had no answer for that, and she did not press him, and they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Wichita morning as husband and wife. The first weeks on the property were full of work, which suited Elvira entirely. She had never been a woman who was comfortable with idleness, and there was so much to do that idleness was not even a temptation. The garden plot needed clearing and planting. The kitchen needed organizing. The 2 rooms that were finished needed cleaning and furnishing with the modest collection of items Bernard had accumulated and the things she had brought with her. She made curtains from cotton she bought at the Wichita dry goods store, plain muslin, because she was practical, but dyed with walnut husks to a warm brown that she found pleasing. She planted kitchen herbs along the south-facing wall of the house where they would get the most sun. She made 2 new quilts because quilting was how she thought, and she needed to think about a great many things. Bernard was outside most of every day, working on the house. The window frames first, because she had asked for tall windows and he was building them tall, and then the second framing for the upper half of the house, and then the porch boards, which he laid with a care that was almost architectural in its precision. He was not a man who spoke much while he worked, but he was present in a way she found she appreciated. And in the evenings they fell into the habit of sitting on the partly finished porch while the day cooled off, drinking coffee and talking, and those hours became the part of the day she found herself looking forward to. They were careful with each other in the way of two people who understood they were building something and did not want to be reckless with the materials. They were courteous, they were honest, they gave each other room to move. But there was something growing between them that was not courtesy and not honesty, something warmer and less formal, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them spoke about it directly, which was perhaps the way of it with people who had spent long enough alone to be careful about wanting things. One evening in the third week, a late spring thunderstorm came up fast from the southwest, the way Kansas storms do, without much warning and with considerable conviction. And Bernard was still on the roof when the first lightning split the sky over the cottonwoods. Elvira came out of the house into the wind and called up to him, and he came down the ladder fast, and they got inside just as the rain hit the roof like something thrown from a great height. They stood in the kitchen, breathing, and then Elvira began to laugh. It was not a polite laugh or a nervous laugh. It was the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and unexpected, and she covered her mouth with her hand, but it came through anyway. And after a moment Bernard laughed too, and the sound of it in the kitchen was so new and so good that they both stopped and looked at each other with a kind of wondering recognition, as though they had each just discovered something they had not known was there. "You have a good laugh," she said, when she had recovered herself. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, open and unguarded in a way his face rarely was. "Elvira," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said. He looked at the window where the rain was running in rivers down the new glass he had fitted that week. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment, at the scar and the dark eyes and the mouth that was almost smiling, and she said, "So am I, Bernard. So am I." It was not yet a declaration of love. It was something more tentative and more real than that. It was two careful people admitting, for the first time, that they were glad to be where they were, and that the person beside them was part of why. The summer settled around the property with the particular weight of Kansas heat, which was significant, and they worked through it with the steady rhythm that life on a homestead requires. The garden came up well better than Elvira had hoped, in fact, because the soil in the lower plot near the creek was rich and dark, and her kitchen herbs thrived on the south wall, and by July she had beans and squash and tomatoes, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that she had planted because she felt like it and that Bernard never commented on except to once say, in passing, that they were the right height. They had neighbors of a sort. The nearest was a family named Dunmore, 4 miles to the north, who had a farm and 5 children, and a general goodwill toward everyone in the county. The wife, Clara Dunmore, rode over in early June to introduce herself and stayed for 3 hours, and left with one of Elvira's preserves and an invitation to come back whenever she liked. Clara was 34, practical, funny, and not at all intimidated by Bernard's reputation, which she said she had heard about, and which she dismissed with a wave of her hand as no concern of hers, since he was clearly not practicing it on his own porch. Clara became Elvira's first real friend in the county, and the friendship was one of the genuine and uncomplicated kind that does not require a great deal of maintenance to remain solid. There was also a man who became important in the story of that summer, though not in a way anyone would have designed. His name was Dillon Carr, and he had known Bernard years before, in the period of Bernard's life that he had described to Elvira with the neutral word work. Dillon Carr was not a neutral man. He was lean and cold-eyed, and he carried grievances the way some men carry water carefully, so that none spills over long distances. He rode onto the property on a Tuesday morning in late July, when Bernard was at the creek checking the irrigation channel and Elvira was in the kitchen with the door open to catch the breeze. She heard the horse and came to the door and looked at the man on it, and something in the way he sat too still, too deliberate, put a chill across her shoulders despite the heat. "Morning," she said from the doorway. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, which was how she knew he was not here by accident. "Yes," she said. "Bernard is at the creek. I'll send for him." "No need," Dylan Carr said, and his hand moved to his coat lapel in a way that was not threatening exactly, but that reminded her of something a snake does when it is considering options. And then Bernard was there, coming around the side of the house with his boots still wet from the creek, and the quality of the silence that fell between him and Dylan Carr was a very specific kind of silence, the kind that has edges. "Carr," Bernard said. "Bernard," Dylan Carr said. "Nice place you've built." Bernard stepped between Carr and the house, between Carr and Elvira, with a movement that was quiet and completely intentional. "What do you want?" Bernard said. "I'm passing through," Carr said. "Thought I'd stop in. We have history after all." "We have debts settled and a parting of ways," Bernard said. "That's not history so much as a conclusion." Carr looked past him at Elvira in the doorway, and she met his gaze without dropping it because she had decided on Thursday morning in the Caldwell hotel parlor that she was not going to be a woman who looked away. "You married up," Carr said to Bernard, with a flatness that was not a compliment. "Move on, Carr," Bernard said quietly. There was a long pause in which the cottonwoods made a sound in the breeze, and Cutter, tied at the post, flicked an ear. And then Dylan Carr turned his horse and rode back the way he had come and did not look back. Bernard watched him until he was well down the road, and then he turned to Elvira, and she could see the tension in him, the held, disciplined tension of a man who had trained himself not to react until he was certain of what he was reacting to. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Who is he?" Bernard came up onto the porch and sat in one of the chairs she had arranged there, and she pulled the other one close and sat facing him, and he told her about Dylan Carr. He told it plainly and without excusing himself, the way he had told her about his past in the hotel parlor, because she had asked for honesty and he had meant to give it. Carr had been a partner of sorts, years ago, in a piece of work that Bernard was not proud of. They had parted badly. Carr had been holding a specific piece of anger since, related to money, and to a situation that Bernard had refused to participate in when it went further than he was willing to go. "He's testing the ground," Bernard said, "seeing where I am and what I have. I want you to know that so you're not taken by surprise if he comes back." "Will he?" she said. "I think he might," Bernard said honestly. "Carr is a man who doesn't let things go. I should have told you more about him before now." "Tell me now," she said. "Everything you think I should know." He did, and when he was done, Elvira sat quietly for a moment looking out at the summer land, and then she said, "You told him to move on and he did. Maybe he'll stay moved." "Maybe," Bernard said. He did not look convinced. "And if he doesn't," she said, "we'll deal with it together." "I'm not going to be sent to town to wait for something to be over, Bernard. I want to be clear about that." He looked at her, and in his face was something that had been building since the first Thursday in the Caldwell parlor, something he had been holding at arm's length because he was a careful man and he did not want to take something that was not freely offered. "Elvira," he said. "What?" she said. "I need you to know something," he said, "and I'm not very good at this kind of talking, so you'll have to be patient with me." She settled back in her chair. "I'm listening." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "When I went to Caldwell," he said, "and asked for the oldest woman on the list, it wasn't out of some philosophy about what a man should look for in a wife. I want to be honest about that. I had convinced myself that an older woman would be less likely to expect things I wasn't sure I could give, things like softness and romance, and all the parts of a marriage that I hadn't had practice at." Elvira waited. "But then you walked into that parlor," he said, "and you sat down and looked at me without flinching and asked me why I wanted you specifically, and I understood almost immediately that I had been wrong about my own reasons. I didn't ask for the oldest woman because I didn't want to be challenged. I asked for you." He stopped and started again. "I think I asked for you because I was looking for someone who would still be here when the easier feeling wore off and the real life started, someone who was in it for the actual thing. The afternoon was very quiet around them. The sunflowers stood in their row along the fence. "And now," Elvira said softly. "And now," he said, with the measured honesty that was the thing she most trusted in him, "I find that the real life and the easier feeling are not as separate as I expected them to be. I find that I look forward to evenings on this porch more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long time. And I would like you to know that." Elvira looked at him for a long moment, at this man who was not easy or soft, but who was honest in a way that cut cleaner than softness ever could, and she felt the door she had opened an inch in the Caldwell parlor swing wide. "Bernard," she said, "I have been telling myself for 3 weeks that what I feel is gratitude and relief and the reasonable affection of a woman who has made a good match. And I think I have been lying to myself. Because what I actually feel is considerably more than that." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on a face before. Not quite wonder and not quite joy, but some place between them. A kind of arriving, as though he had been walking a very long way and had just recognized the landscape. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on the porch while the summer light went golden over the Kansas grass, and the creek caught it and threw it back, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying just then. That evening was the first time he kissed her standing in the kitchen after supper, when he had come to say good night as he sometimes did, and she had turned from the shelf where she was putting away a dish, and they were very close, and he put his free hand against her face, gentle and deliberate, his thumb at the corner of her jaw, and looked at her with a question in his eyes that she answered before he could finish asking it. He kissed her the way he did everything, without hurry, without performance, with a thoroughness that suggested he meant it completely, and she kissed him back with the full honest weight of what she felt, and when they drew apart they were both quiet for a moment, slightly breathless, the kitchen lamp making a small warm world around them. "Well," Elvira said finally. "Well," Bernard said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the smile that still startled her with how much it changed his face. She laughed, and then he laughed, and the sound of it rose up through the new roof of the house and out into the Kansas night like something being set free. Dillon Carr did come back, as Bernard had suspected he might. He came back on a morning in early August, not alone this time. He had 2 men with him who had the loose, watchful quality of men accustomed to being used for their size and their willingness. They rode into the yard before dawn, when the sky was that particular blue-black of the last hour before light, and it was Cutter who woke Bernard, the gelding moving restlessly in the small stable, and making a sound that was not quite a whinny but something that meant the same thing. Bernard was out of bed and had his boots and his revolvers on before the sound fully registered, the training of years making it reflexive, and he turned to find Elvira already standing, reaching for the rifle she had asked him 2 weeks ago to show her how to handle properly. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "I told you," she began. "Not because I think you need protecting," he said, equally quiet. "Because if something happens out there, I need to know exactly where you are." She held his eyes for a moment, reading the sense in this. "The left side of the window," she said. "I'll be at the left side of the window with the rifle. If you need a second angle, I have it." He looked at her for one fierce, clear second. "Left side," he confirmed, and went out. What happened in the yard in the last darkness before dawn was not a gunfight in the dramatic sense of the word. It was a confrontation, a standing of ground, a reckoning. Bernard walked out into the yard in the blue-black dark and stood with both hands loose at his sides and called out to Dillon Carr, and Carr answered from beside the stable, and the 2 men who had ridden with Carr were in the shadows near the fence. Bernard said, in a voice that carried the absolute calm of a man who had settled every uncertainty inside himself before walking through the door, "You are on my land, Carr, and I will give you one chance to turn around and leave it." "You owe me, Bernard," Carr said. "You always did. The Laredo job." "The Laredo job was 11 years ago," Bernard said, "and you were paid your share of what we took before I walked away from it. Whatever you think I owe you, you are wrong. I think you walked away and left me to face consequences I shouldn't have faced alone, Carr said, and there was something in his voice now that was genuinely wounded beneath the anger, a real grievance, however distorted. Bernard was quiet for a moment. I left because what was being asked was something I wouldn't do, he said. I told you that then. I'm sorry for what came after, Carr. I am. But I won't be held responsible for choices I didn't make. In the window of the house, Elvira held the rifle and watched and waited, her hands steady, her heart loud in her ears. The standoff stretched through the last of the darkness, and then Dylan Carr made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a bitter, exhausted sound. You really did walk away from it all, Carr said, looking at the house, the garden, the sunflowers along the fence. Yes, Bernard said. Another silence. One of the men with Carr shifted in the shadows, and Elvira's finger moved, and Bernard stood very still. I'm tired, Carr said finally, and it sounded like a confession. I've been carrying this for 11 years, and I'm tired, Bernard said, then put it down. The dawn came up behind them while Carr sat on his horse in the yard, and the gray light touched the land and the creek and the cottonwoods and the sunflowers and the house with its tall windows, and Elvira watched from the window with the rifle and her breath held. Dylan Carr turned his horse around. The two men with him followed. They rode out of the yard and down the road north, and the new morning closed behind them like water over a stone. Bernard stood in the yard for a moment after they were gone, and then he turned and walked back to the house, and Elvira met him at the door. She set the rifle against the wall and took his face in her hands, both hands, the scar on one side and the unscared side on the other, and looked at him. Are you all right? She said. Yes, he said. He covered her hands with his. You had the left side of the window. I had the left side of the window, she confirmed. Good, he said. He turned his head slightly and pressed his mouth against her palm, and she felt it through her whole body, the relief and the tenderness and the love. And yes, it was love. She knew it clearly in that moment, knew it the way you know the weather when you step outside and feel it on your face, undeniably and without qualification. I love you, she said quietly, as the morning light came through the tall windows and fell across the floor. He was still for a moment, and then he said it back, I love you, Elvira. And the way he said her name, the way it sat in his voice, made it sound like the most honest thing he had ever said, which she believed it was. The rest of August and into September was the finest time she had ever known. The fear of Carr passing and the declaration of the morning changing everything, they moved through the days differently, more openly, more warmly, with an ease between them that had not quite been present before. He began to touch her without the deliberateness of before, casually, the way people do when they are comfortable, a hand at her back in passing, his shoulder against hers on the porch, the way he would sometimes pause behind her when she was at the shelf and rest his chin briefly on the top of her head, which she found she loved completely. She learned more of him as the weeks passed. She learned that he woke early always before the birds, and that the first hour of the morning was when he was most himself, most open, least guarded, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and whatever small thing he was turning over in his mind. She developed the habit of rising early too, not because she was naturally inclined to it, but because she loved those mornings, the kitchen in the half-light with the coffee smell and his quiet company. She learned that the scar did pain him in the cold, as he had said, and that he would not mention it unless she asked. And so she began to notice when it was bothering him, the slight tightening around his left eye, and she would bring him the small clay pot of the liniment she had learned to make from Clara Dunmore, who had a recipe for such things, and she would not make a production of it, just set it within his reach, and he would take it without ceremony and use it, and that was that. She learned that he could not abide meanness. He was a man who had lived with violence and had made his peace with the fact of it in the world, but meanness, cruelty for its own sake, the belittling of people who could not defend themselves, made something hard come into his face. She saw this once in town, when a merchant spoke sharply to an elderly Mexican man who was trying to conduct a transaction and did not have enough English to make himself understood. And Bernard stepped in calmly and finished the transaction and spoke to the merchant afterward in a voice too quiet for Elvira to hear, but that produced a marked change in the man's manner. He never mentioned it when they got back to the wagon. She brought it up herself. "You did a good thing in there," she said. "Man needed help," Bernard said simply. "And the merchant needed a word," she said. "That too," he agreed. She learned that he was generous with the Dunmore children, who were fascinated by his revolvers and came over sometimes with their father on farm business, and would stand at a distance, looking at the guns, the way children look at things they know are dangerous and cannot stop being interested in. He never let them touch the revolvers, but he would answer their questions honestly and without condescension. And once she caught him carving a small wooden horse for the youngest Dunmore boy while he sat on the porch on a Sunday afternoon, with the focused, quiet expression of a man doing something he was not going to announce. She did not say anything about the wooden horse. She went back inside and smiled at the kitchen shelf where her books were arranged in the order she had chosen. And she thought about the man on the porch, and everything she knew about him, and everything she was still learning. And she felt so thoroughly and unexpectedly happy that it sat in her chest like light. In October, Elvira discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, turning it over in the privacy of her thoughts while the October wind came down from the north, and the cottonwoods went gold along the creek. On the 3rd morning she told Bernard at the kitchen table, in the early light, over their coffee. He set down his cup very carefully and looked at her with an expression so unguarded, it was almost painful to see something vast and undefended moving through his face. "Are you certain?" he said. "Clara Dunmore has had 5 children," Elvira said. She was certain. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face and waited. "Elvira," he said very quietly. "I know," she said. "It's a great deal. It's the best thing," he said. I need a moment with it." She let him have the moment. He sat with his coffee and looked at the table and then at the window and then at her, and what was in his face when he looked at her was so clear and so full that she had to look down at her own cup. "Are you happy?" he asked. "About it?" She looked back up at him. "Bernard, I am so happy about it that I have been walking around for 2 days not knowing what to do with myself." He reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Then I'm the happiest man in Kansas." She laughed, and he squeezed her hand, and outside the window the October light came slanting gold across the land, and the creek and the cottonwood trees dropping their leaves into the water. The pregnancy shaped the winter, and it was a good winter, which is not something that can be said of every Kansas winter. Bernard finished the house, the upper loft, the remaining rooms, the porch boards he had been working on all summer with a focused energy that Elvira understood was his way of doing the thing he most needed to do, which was to make sure the house was right before the spring. She let him do it and took care of the kitchen and the garden preparations for the cold months and the quilting and Clara Dunmore's company, which was a genuine comfort as the days shortened and the temperature dropped. They had long evenings by the fire, and those evenings were some of the best of her life. He read aloud to her from the books on the shelf slowly at first, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had taught himself late, but growing more fluent as the weeks passed, and something in him relaxed around the act of reading, as though the late start was no longer something to be self-conscious about. She loved listening to him read, the way his voice gave weight to the words, the way he would sometimes stop to think about something and ask her what she thought. She told him stories from her childhood, and he told her stories from his, and the exchange of these old things was a kind of intimacy she had not expected from a man who had been so private at first, a gift he was giving her in pieces, trusting her with each one. December came and the first real snow of the season, and Bernard brought the 2 cats in from the stable, which he had resisted for months on the grounds that cats were working animals and the stable was their domain, and which he eventually surrendered on the grounds that it was cold and they were small. Elvira watched the cats arrange themselves with great satisfaction on the hearthrug. "You're fond of those cats," she said from across the room. "They serve a practical function," Bernard said. "Yes," she said. On the hearthrug, the corner of his mouth lifted. "They were cold," he said. She said, which was all she said about it. By January, the upper loft was done and the house was warm and complete, and Elvira stood in each room at different times of day and felt the rightness of it. The tall windows she had asked for letting the winter light come through, the books on the shelf Bernard had built for them, the hearthrug with the cats, the kitchen with the good stove, and the herbs she had hung to dry in bundles from the ceiling beam. It was home, entirely and without reservation, and the feeling of it was something she had not known she was missing until she found it. The spring came in March, still cold but brightening, and the creek ran high with snowmelt and the cottonwoods put out the first pale green of new leaves. In March also, a letter arrived from Caldwell, forwarded through the Wichita Post from Horace Pell at the Herald. The letter said, briefly and somewhat formally, that a man named Garrett Hollies had come to Caldwell asking about Bernard Winslow, and that Mr. Pell thought it his responsibility to inform Mr. Winslow of this, as the man had not appeared to have friendly intentions. Bernard read the letter at the table and set it down without expression. "Hollies," he said. "Someone from before," Elvira said from the stove. "An old story," he said. "A bounty job I did in '76. Hollies had a brother who was the subject of it. The brother went to prison and died there 2 years later. And Hollies blames you." "Hollies has been circling for years," Bernard said. "He's not like Carr. Carr had a grievance that was at least half reasonable. Hollies is the kind of man who needs someone to be responsible for something that was nobody's fault but his brother's." Elvira turned from the stove and looked at him. "What do we do?" she said. He looked up at her and said, "I'll go to Caldwell." "No," she said immediately. "Elvira, you are not going to Caldwell to face Garrett Hollies alone while I stay here with our child growing," she said, flatly and without particular anger, just the clear declaration of a woman who had thought this through in the 60 seconds since he said it. He held her gaze. "I can't bring you into, you are not bringing me into it," she said. "I am in it. I have been in it since Thursday afternoon in the Caldwell Hotel parlor, and I will not be removed from it now because you have decided to be noble." She came to the table and sat across from him. "We will figure out what to do about Garrett Hollies together. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him wrestling with the deep instinct of a man who had always faced his dangers alone, the man who had been alone for so long that protection had become reflex. "Yes," he said finally. "Good," she said. "Now tell me everything about Hollies." He did. And they sat together at the kitchen table and talked it through, and what they agreed on was this. Bernard would write to the marshal in Wichita, with whom he had a history that was not friendly but was at least professional, and disclose Hollies's movements and the relevant history. There were laws now in Kansas, and Wichita's marshal was a man who took his jurisdiction seriously. Garrett Hollies pursuing a grievance across state lines would be of interest to him. It was not the dramatic solution. It was not a gunfight in the street or a confrontation at dawn. It was paperwork and the practical machinery of law, which Bernard had more faith in now than he had at 25, when he had thought law was something that happened to other people. The marshal in Wichita responded within 2 weeks, and what he communicated was that Hollies had been located, had been spoken to in terms that left no ambiguity about what pursuing Bernard Winslow further would cost him, and had been encouraged strongly to return to his home in Missouri, which he had done. When the letter came, Bernard read it and set it on the table and was quiet for a moment. "Done," he said. "Done," Elvira confirmed. He looked across the table at her, and she could see the full weight of the past lifting from him in a way it had not yet done all of it, Carr and Hollies and the years before and the things he had carried setting itself down at last. "Elvira," he said. "Bernard," she said. "I want you to know," he said carefully, that when I rode into Caldwell and asked Pell for the oldest woman on that list, I had no idea what I was walking toward. Neither did I, she said. But I knew in that parlor, he said. Within the first 10 minutes of sitting across from you, I knew. She smiled at him, the real smile, the one she had never given reflexively but had given him more times than she could count now. So did I, she said. I knew, and I was absolutely terrified. Good, he said with a quiet amusement. I'd have been worried if you weren't. Their son was born in late April, when the Kansas spring was in full voice outside the windows. The cottonwoods in new green leaf and the creek running clear, and the first wildflowers coming up along the fence, where the sunflowers would come later. Clara Dunmore came and delivered him with the competent calm of a woman who had delivered 5 of her own and knew what she was doing. And the birth was hard in the way that births are long and honest and exhausting. And Bernard sat outside the bedroom door for the better part of a night before Clara came out, and said, with a broad smile, that he could come in. He sat on the edge of the bed beside Elvira, who was pale and tired, and had her hair loose around her shoulders, and was holding a small red-faced boy in the crook of her arm, and he looked at both of them with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and would keep in the very center of her memory for the rest of her life. He reached out one large, careful hand and touched the top of the baby's head very gently and said absolutely nothing. "Bernard," she said. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" she said gently, echoing the question he had asked her in the yard on the morning of Carr's final visit. He made a sound that was half laugh and entirely undone. "I don't have words for this," he said. "You don't need them," she said. "Here." She shifted the baby carefully and held him out, and Bernard took him with both hands, with a caution so precise and thorough it made her chest ache, and held him against his chest and looked down at the boy's face. They named the boy James after Bernard's father, who had been a good man by Bernard's account, not present enough, not warm enough, but good in the ways that counted, and the name felt right in Elvira's mouth and in the house. James Winslow grew as spring babies do, fast and determined, and the house accommodated him with the ease of a house that had been built to hold life. The loft became the baby's room, and Elvira quilted the walls with warm colors, and Bernard built a small cradle that was not the most elegant thing he had ever built, but was solid and safe and smooth, with no rough edges, which she said was all that mattered. The summer of 1883 was the fullest summer Elvira had ever known. James learned to smile, and then to laugh, and then to sit up, and each thing he did was witnessed by both of them with a delight that she had not known was available to her. This specific joy, the one that belongs to watching a new person discover the world. Clara Dunmore became an aunt in all but blood, coming over with her own children and sitting on the porch, and letting her youngest play with James while the older children ran in the yard. Her husband Tom rode over on Sundays sometimes to talk over the farming news with Bernard, and the two men had developed the kind of friendship that men build over practical things. They helped each other with the larger tasks that required more than 2 hands. They talked about the soil and the weather, and the market prices with the frank camaraderie of men who respected each other's competence. In the fall of 1883, Elvira began teaching 2 of the Dunmore children who were not yet old enough for the schoolhouse in Wichita. She taught them at the kitchen table 3 mornings a week reading and figures and the practical geography of the world they lived in, and she found that she was good at it, and that it fed something in her that the quilting and the gardening, as satisfying as they were, did not quite reach. "You should teach more of them," Bernard said one evening, when she was telling him about the day's lessons and the particular satisfaction of watching a child sound out a word they had been struggling with. "There's only the Dunmore children near enough," she said. "There's also the Riley family 3 miles east," he said. "They have 4 children, and I don't think any of them are schooled." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I have," he said. "You're good at it. It would be a service to the county, and you would be," he searched for the right word, "glad. It would make you glad." She reached across the porch between their chairs and took his hand. "You pay attention," she said. "I try to," he said. She wrote to the Riley family the following week, and they accepted gratefully. And by the following spring she had 7 students coming to the Winslow kitchen 3 mornings a week. And the kitchen table had been extended, and the shelf of books turned partly into a lending library for the children. And Bernard had built a second shelf for Elvira's personal collection, so it would not be confused with the school books. The kitchen was sometimes loud on school mornings, which was a thing Elvira had not expected to love as much as she did. Bernard would take James out to the stable on those mornings, ostensibly for practical stable-related reasons, and she would catch sight of them through the kitchen window, the broad, scarred man and the small, determined boy Cutter nosing at James's hair and James shrieking with laughter. And the love she felt was so large it was occasionally almost frightening. In 1884, when James was nearing 2 years old and beginning to say words with the delighted incomprehension of a toddler discovering language, Elvira discovered she was expecting a second child. She told Bernard in the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table, in the early morning light, over coffee, and his response was the same in quality if slightly less stunned in expression. "Again," he said, and then immediately, I mean, I know what you mean," she said. "Yes, again." He looked at her across the table with a warmth so unguarded that she would have teased him about it if she had not been equally unguarded herself. "We're going to need a larger table," he said. "We are going to need a considerably larger table," she agreed. He built it over the winter, in the evenings and on the short winter days, a long oak table with room for 12 that he fitted into the kitchen with a precision that suggested he had measured very carefully. When it was done, Elvira ran her hand along the smooth surface and said that it was the most beautiful table she had ever seen, which she meant entirely, and he said it was just a table, which he did not mean at all. Their daughter was born in June of 1884, and they named her Alice, after Elvira's mother, and she came into the world with considerably less drama than James had and considerably more volume, announcing herself from the first with a clarity of purpose that Elvira recognized, and that made Bernard say, in the first hour of Alice's life, that she had her mother's quality of never being vague about what she wanted, which Elvira took as the compliment it was. James was cautious about Alice at first, and then curious, and then completely devoted, in the way of toddlers who have decided that the new small person belongs specifically to them. He would bring her things, small stones, pieces of grass, the wooden horse Bernard had carved him, and present them with the gravity of important diplomatic gifts, and Alice would regard him with her serious newborn eyes, and he would look back at her with tremendous satisfaction. Bernard built a second cradle. He made it a little better than the first. By the fall of 1884, the Winslow property had become something that bore very little resemblance to the 160 acres of empty Kansas grassland that Elvira had ridden across 2.5 years before on a wagon with 2 crates and a box of books. The house was complete and warm and full. The garden was substantial. There were chickens now, Elvira's insistence, and they had proven their worth many times over, and a second horse, a sturdy brown mare named Clover that Elvira had chosen herself from a sale in Wichita, and that she rode on the days when the teaching was done, and the children were managed, and she needed the particular freedom of the land passing beneath her at a pace that suited her. Clara Dunmore and her family came for a Sunday supper in October, and Tom brought 2 bottles of apple brandy from his own trees, and they sat around the long oak table that Bernard had built, and ate the meal Elvira had made and talked about the harvest and the state of the road between their 2 properties and the plans for the winter. And the Dunmore children chased James around the yard until the light was gone, and the fireflies came up, and James caught one in both hands and brought it to show Bernard, who looked at the small cupped hands and the glow coming through his son's fingers and said, softly, to no one in particular, "Look at that." After the Dunmores went home and the children were in bed, Bernard and Elvira sat on the porch in the cool October dark, wrapped in the quilt she had made in the first weeks at the property, the brown and cream one, the first thing she had finished in the new house, and they looked out at the night land and the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous Kansas sky full of stars. "Do you remember Thursday afternoon in Caldwell?" Bernard said. "I remember everything about Thursday afternoon in Caldwell," she said. "I was so certain," he said, "that asking for you specifically was the sensible thing to do, the practical thing. A woman who wasn't expecting," he paused, "all of this." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And instead," she said, "and instead," he said, "I got all of this." She felt the vibration of his voice through his chest and shoulder, and she said quietly into the dark, "Are you sorry?" He put his arm around her and pulled her closer, and the October stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl asked its late question to the creek. "Elvira," he said, and his voice was full of everything, full of the full years and the table and the children asleep in the house and the land and the two cats on the hearthrug and the books on the shelves and the mornings he had not known were coming. "I am so far from sorry that I do not have a word for it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Glad. The word is glad." "Glad," he said, testing it. "Yes, that's the one." They sat on the porch a while longer under the October stars, and the house was warm behind them, and the land was wide and quiet around them, and every thread of every story that had brought them here. The advertisement in the Caldwell Herald, the Thursday afternoon in the parlor, the nights by the fire and the summer dawn and the yard confrontation, and the kitchen table, and the children and the table he had built for 12. Every thread ran true and tight and held fast, woven together into the particular and irreplaceable fabric of a life that was whole. In the years that followed, the teaching expanded. By 1886, Elvira had enough students coming to the Winslow kitchen on school mornings that Bernard built a proper schoolroom onto the back of the house. A light-filled room with large windows, because his wife had opinions about windows, and a proper board for writing, and shelves for the books that had outgrown the kitchen. The county took note of this informal school, and the following year it was given a small formal recognition and a modest stipend from the county educational fund, which Elvira received without fanfare and Bernard received on her behalf when she was home with Alice, who at 3 had developed a will that required active parental management. James, by the age of 4, had learned to sit a horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been placed in a saddle almost before he could walk, which was because he had been, Bernard having begun the lessons the previous year with a patience and thoroughness that Elvira watched with great pleasure. James also had his mother's reading habit. He would sit with a book at his father's side on the porch, with a solemnity that the grown-ups tried not to smile at too visibly, turning pages with great deliberateness. Alice, on the other hand, was interested in the horses and the chickens and the creek and the outdoor world in general, with an energy that kept both her parents active, and she had Bernard's quality of silence combined with Elvira's quality of absolute directness, which was a combination that suggested she would grow up to be formidable. Bernard had this opinion early and expressed it to Elvira one evening with something that was not quite trepidation, but was adjacent to it. "She's not yet 4, Elvira said. "I know," Bernard said. "That's what concerns me." Elvira laughed. "She gets it from both sides," she said. "We have no one to blame but ourselves." "True," he said and smiled. In the spring of 1887, a man came to the door of the Winslow property on a Wednesday morning. He was older than Bernard by perhaps 10 years, thin and gray-bearded, and he stood at the porch with his hat in his hands and his horse at the post and asked to speak to Bernard Winslow. Elvira came to the door because Bernard was in the schoolroom fixing a window latch and she was closer. "Who shall I say is calling?" she said. "Thomas Reeves," the man said. "He won't know me. I was a witness at a courthouse in Wichita some years ago and I shook his hand." Elvira looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. She brought him into the kitchen and Bernard came in from the schoolroom, and they all sat at the long oak table, and Thomas Reeves explained that he had been in Wichita that day in 1882 as a witness to something else entirely, a property dispute he had lost, and that he had subsequently lost his small farm and had been 5 years making his way across the country doing whatever work presented itself. He had remembered the couple in the courthouse hallway because, he said simply, they had seemed glad. "I remembered thinking that," he said, "that those two people seemed glad to be starting something together, and I thought about it sometimes when things were not going well for me." He was not asking for anything. He had simply been passing through, recognized the name Winslow on the county school roster that was posted in the Wichita post office, and had followed it here on an impulse he couldn't entirely explain. Elvira gave him a meal and they talked for the better part of an afternoon, and when Thomas Reeves stood to leave, Bernard walked him to his horse and said something to him that Elvira could not hear from the porch, and Thomas Reeves listened and looked at the ground and then looked up and said something back, and they shook hands. When Bernard came back to the porch, Elvira said, "What did you tell him?" "I told him we have a bunkhouse," Bernard said, "and that the property could use another set of hands if he was looking for steady work." She looked at him. "He said yes," she said. "He said yes," Bernard said. Thomas Reeves stayed. He proved himself in the first month to be exactly the kind of man the property needed: steady, experienced with livestock, familiar with the practical demands of a Kansas farm, and possessed of a dry and gentle humor that made him easy company. He lived in the small bunkhouse that Bernard had built the previous year in anticipation of eventually needing hired help, and he became in time as much a part of the life of the place as the cottonwoods and the creek. James, who was 5 by then, attached himself to Thomas Reeves with the enthusiasm of a small boy who has found an admiring audience for his collection of interesting rocks and small animals. And Thomas Reeves received this attachment with a grandpaternal warmth that was unmistakable. He had grown children somewhere in Missouri who he wrote to on occasion, and James seemed to fill some space in him that those letters reached only partway. The schoolroom by 1887 had 12 students on any given morning, ranging from 5 to 14 years of age, and Elvira had organized them into 2 levels, and had developed a curriculum that she was genuinely proud of: reading and writing and arithmetic, and some geography and a great deal of natural history, because the natural world of the Kansas plains was immediately available for study, and she saw no reason not to use it. She had also begun to teach some of the older students penmanship and composition, the skill of putting thoughts on paper in good order, which she believed to be one of the most useful things a person could know how to do. Bernard built more shelves. In 1888, they received a letter from Horace Pell in Caldwell, informing them that the Caldwell Ladies' Arrangement Society had officially dissolved, as there were enough women in the county now to constitute a natural order of things without organized brokerage. Pell ended the letter with a line that read, "I believe Mr. and Mrs. Winslow were perhaps the arrangement's finest result." Bernard read this line twice and then handed the letter to Elvira without comment. She read it, folded it, and set it on the table. "I think Horace Pell has a sentimental streak he works hard to hide," she said. "I think you're right," Bernard said. "We should write back," she said. They did, and the letter from Caldwell marked the last loose end of the life they had come from, tied off neatly and set aside. On a warm October evening in 1889, 7 years after the Thursday afternoon in the Caldwell Hotel parlor, Bernard and Elvira sat on the porch of the house on the 160 acres and watched the sunset move across the Kansas land the way it does in that country, broadly and without apology, painting everything gold and rust and the deep blue-green of the creek at dusk. James, now 7, was in the schoolroom with a book he had borrowed from the shelf. Alice, at 5, had finally, after considerable negotiation, been put to bed, where she would stay until she was certain no one was doing anything interesting without her. Thomas Reeves was at the stable, the cats were on the hearthrug, the supper things were done. "Bernard," Elvira said. "He said, he had his coffee, he always had his coffee. "Do you ever think about it," she said, "about how close it came to not happening?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If you'd asked for the second oldest," she said, "or if I hadn't sent back that reply, or if the storm had come a day earlier and we'd been inside and not on the porch, and I'd never told you I was frightened." He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything that she brought him that was serious. "Yes," he said, "I think about it. And it makes me very glad," he said, "that I asked for the oldest woman on the list." She laughed softly and leaned her head back against the porch post and watched the last of the sunset go copper and then dark above the cottonwoods. "Horace Pell's face," she said, remembering. "He thought I was either very brave or very strange," Bernard said. "Both," she said. "You were both." "I prefer courageous," he said, with the dry half-seriousness that was one of the things she loved most in him. "Then courageous," she said magnanimously. The stars were coming out now over the Kansas plain, the first ones always in the east, the sky deepening from its last blue into the full dark of a clear October night. Somewhere down by the creek, a frog was making its opinions known. The wind in the cottonwoods said the familiar thing it always said, which she had come to love as much as any sound she knew. She reached across the arm of her chair and found his hand where it rested, and he turned his palm up and held hers. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "What?" "That Thursday morning before I went to the hotel," she said. "Standing at my window in the old house before I was any of this, before I was your wife, before the land and the school and James and Alice and all of it. I was standing there in the blue dress thinking about how frightened I was and about how I was going to go anyway because being frightened was no excuse for not living." He was quiet, listening. "And I think," she said, "that the woman at that window would not have believed any of it. The house, the children, the table, you." She squeezed his hand. "She would not have believed that this was what was coming." "What would you tell her if you could?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I'd tell her to go," she said. "I'd tell her to put on the blue dress and go to the hotel and look at the man with the scar and not look away. I'd tell her that what's frightening and what's worth it are, in this case, exactly the same thing." Bernard was quiet for a moment, and she felt the weight and warmth of his hand around hers. "Elvira," he said. "Yes. I would like to tell you something I have never said in exactly these words." She waited. "Every morning," he said, "when I wake up in the dark before the birds, the first thing I know is that you're there. Before the coffee and before I remember what day it is and before any of the rest of it. Just that you're there. And that is the best part of every day." The creek talked to the stones below the cottonwoods. The stars assembled themselves in their ancient arrangement overhead. The house behind them was warm and full and sound. Elvira turned her head and looked at her husband, at the scar and the dark eyes, and the steady, honest face that she had looked at 10,000 times and found, each time, to be exactly the face she wanted to be looking at. "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "Good," he said. "I feel the same way," she said. "I know," he said. "You're insufferably certain sometimes," she said. "I know," he said again, and the corner of his mouth lifted into the smile that was still, after all this time, the thing she loved most on his face, the one that opened everything up, that said, "Here I am. Here we are, this is real and I know it is and I am not afraid of it." She smiled back, the real one, the full one, the one she gave him without any reservation at all. The October night settled around the house on the 160 acres, and the two people on the porch sat together under the vast Kansas sky in the particular and irreplaceable warmth of a life that had been built honestly, from the ground up, on good land and good faith, and the rare and fortunate luck of two people who, against all reasonable expectation, had found in each other exactly what they had needed without quite knowing they had been looking for it. Inside the house, in the loft above the schoolroom, James turned a page in his book. In her room, Alice slept with the absolute conviction of a 5-year-old who would wake in the morning ready to negotiate the terms of everything. Thomas Reeves, in the bunkhouse, wrote a letter to his daughter in Missouri that said, among other things, that he had found a good place and good people, and that she should not worry. The cats on the hearthrug twitched in their dreams. The coffee in Bernard's cup was the last of the evening's pot. The cottonwoods made their familiar sound. And on the porch, in the October dark, with the stars coming down to the horizon in every direction, and the creek running clean in its old channel, and the land lying broad and still, and theirs, all the way to the edge of the light, Elvira Ellsworth Winslow and Bernard Winslow held on to each other's hands and did not let go.